Hello, everyone. My name is Eric Edward. I'm the Executive Director of McPhail Woods and have been with the project since 1998. I welcome you all, and I'm excited to say that we have over 50 individuals registered for the presentation tonight. We'll just give you guys a minute to all get settled. This is our first webinar ever, so bear with us. It's also our first installment in our four-part series exploring coastal ecosystems and how we can restore them. Um, Just some points of business. There is a Q&A at the bottom that you can use to ask questions at the end of this presentation. If you want to use the chat to ask questions throughout or just post comments, please do. Otherwise, we will just get started. So, before we get started, especially as we consider our coasts and how to protect them, I would like to acknowledge that the land on which we work is unceded Mi'kmaq territory, and to pay our respects to the Mi'kmaq people, past, present, and future. Today, I ask that we stop to consider how, for 10,000 years, the Mi'kmaq people lived and thrived on the bounty of these coasts while preserving their integrity and resilience. I would also like to recognize that the land in which we work is the indigenous Wabanaki forest, which is a diverse and complex forest ecosystem encompassing upland, wetland, riparian, and coastal forest habitats. These webinars are part of our community-based approach to restoring PEI's Coastal Shield project, made possible with the financial support of PEI's Climate Challenge Fund. The goal of our project is to provide islanders, like yourself, with the knowledge and skills needed to take an active role in restoring our coastal ecosystems. That will in turn protect you, your homes, infrastructure, and businesses. No form of armoring is permanent, and our island exists in a dynamic environment. Tonight, the presentation will be led by Daniel McCrae. Daniel has been a key member of the McPhail's team for nearly 20 years. For the past six, he's been studying crumholts, or coastal habitats, and is now turning this work into the basis of his research as he pursues a master's in environmental science at UPEI. At the end, there will be time for questions, which we ask you type into the Q&A, as I mentioned before. And without further ado, I give you Daniel and Coastal Stories and Shifting Sands.
Thanks so much, Eric. Hi, it's hello everyone who I can't see. It's so weird. It's great. Um, if everyone can see and hear us fine, maybe if a couple of people want to just write in the chat, like thumbs up, just to make sure that it's all. Oh, I saw a hand go up. I'm gonna take it as a positive hand. Okay, I'm gonna make you stop seeing me, and I'm going to share the pictures of this presentation. And I'm going to hope it works. Yes, thumbs up are floating around the screen now. Wow, this is amazing. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much. My name is Daniel, as Eric said, and I've been really lucky to get to explore cool coastal places across Prince Edward Island, a little bit across the Maritimes. Um, this is one of the sites that we looked at during the coastal project through some federal and provincial funding. So this East Point Lighthouse and the Crumholts there. And then we've just got kind of the Coastal Stewardship webinar series. You can kind of see what's coming up. So if you're not registered for the next ones, please get registered. But yeah, I'm going to start with shameless self-promotion. If you're not already aware, hopefully you know what McPhail Woods has been doing for since 1991. But we're a nonprofit here on PEI, and we do a whole bunch of different stuff, a lot of different environmental education. We grow a lot of different species. So come on out. We've got owl prowls coming up in the next month and then stuff all year long. You can learn more about all that good stuff on our website. And of course, huge thank you to the province and the Climate Challenge Fund for making all this happen. So this is part of our kind of greater Restoring Our Coastal Shield Climate Challenge Fund project. And there's a whole bunch of writing there. You can learn more about it on our website, but effectively it's kind of a four-part kind of thing. So we've got these webinars happening, which you guys are participating in. Thank you. We'll be having volunteer plantings with the PEI provincial parks. So these will be really fun coastal plantings that are going to be functional, like kind of restoration based, but then a chance for people to get out, help your local community, help public land, take your kids out, have a really fun time, and then get some hands-on learning. So, kind of trying to hit all the buttons so you can learn here digitally, virtually. Then you can head off into outdoors and get dirty. And then you can eventually, we'll be producing and putting out for free a coastal stewardship guidebook. So then you can read about all that stuff when you get home if you get really geeky into it. And then as part of this too, we're also continuing our coastal plant propagation program, I'm going to call it, but we've been collecting different species, seeds, cuttings, and figuring out how to get them to grow healthy and well, and also in great numbers when possible, for all this restoration work that all the great groups across PEI are doing. And yeah, this kind of, McPhail Woods, as I said, has been around since 1991, and we've been doing restoration work, starting with Gary Schneider and a shovel, and eventually to a whole team of wonderful people and partners. But, our coastal work particularly really took off over the Coastal Forest Project, starting in kind of end of 2019, 2020. And that was another publicly funded project through the it's a bit of a mouthful, but the PEI Forested Landscape Priority Place for Species at Risk funding. It's called FLPP for short. And that was a federal provincial partnership. And this was a huge thing that a whole bunch of different organizations across the Maritimes benefited from. And we got a chance to all work together. So I just wanted to, there's a whole bunch of great different land stewards, conservationists, restoration groups, all kinds of and public educators who we've gotten to work with. And so this was a chance where we really started playing along our coastal forests and learning a lot about how they grow. Oh yeah, and then as Eric said, we're taking that into the academic level. I've started a master's, so we're going to be continuing to learn more and do more across these wonderful habitats. So now we can get to the meat of it. Yeah, so this whole thing is really about looking at how we relate and live on our land, right? It's our stewardship. And it's kind of one of those things where we often think of stewardship when we're thinking about conservation. If we can put aside a really beautiful swamp or a beautiful meadow or something and say we're going to protect that, and that's a form of stewardship. But, it's an ongoing action, and it kind of is very colored by our perceptions and our knowledge about the land that we live on, whether it's the ways that we use it, those rickety docks are, I think, at Black Pond, in the kind of mid late 1800s. So, I've seen some rickety stairs down the cliffs, but those are pretty cool. And that was because we had to. That's where we fished. That's where we ate. We didn't have food shipping in from across the world at that point in time. So our perceptions about our coasts, our needs, they really inform our stewardship, and that really changes our coasts. So, we're one of the animals here too, and it's, kind of coloring this perspective. So the talk today is going to be a bit more wide viewed, looking at some natural history, kind of understanding some of the coastal processes, and, kind of appreciating our role as species who are also always stewarding this land and, being aware of the choices that we're making. And PEI is no stranger to great storytelling. We've got hundreds of small halls, lots of great storytellers, singers, lots of gossip. We love our history and we love our culture. We've even got small little cultures across PEI that make up the greater PEI culture, and we celebrate that a lot. We do sometimes forget here on PEI, as much as we love our beaches and our shores and rolling hills, we forget about our natural history. We don't have a curator of natural history here on PEI, working with the PEI museums yet. We don't have a natural history museum. Most of our collections for natural history are actually stored in Nova Scotia and other kind of larger facilities that have the places for them. But it's one of those things where our natural coasts, our animals, our trees are also storytellers too. And sometimes it's just kind of about starting to learn some of those stories. So one of the pictures there is the kind of cover pages of the natural history of Prince Edward Island, written by Francis Bain, who was a naturalist in the late 1800s, early 1900s. He wrote that in 1890. And this was like a natural history PEI, but also a textbook that the schools would use, right? So this was a province-wide school textbook that kids in one-room schoolhouses would use the native natural history of PEI, the species, to go outside from their one-room schoolhouse, to work inside to learn reading and writing and math and stuff, right? So there are points where that would be seen as a crazy innovative curriculum nowadays. And this was back in 1890. So there's lots of hidden stories in nature, and hopefully we're going to start through these presentations and this whole project is start to let you see some of those stories and learn your part in stewarding that land and getting involved. Just on the bottom right, you've got those cool fossils and stuff. Those are out of our cliffs. So those were all found in the 1800s. One of them is the jawbone of a big old Dimetrodon, one of those sailback kind of dinosaur looking things. Um, so we've got all kinds of hidden stories. So part of becoming a steward is starting to just, engage and take note of what's going on in your property. And, these are just examples of some of the stories that can be hidden or more obvious or just take a little bit of logic. So, those tree rings, we all know, represent a year of growth for those species that do that. They're natural calendars, right? So we can look at those and get the age of a tree or how old that forest is. And now the Europeans, when they first arrived here in PEI, they didn't know that detail. So they did cut down lots of trees and they saw lots of tree rings, but they couldn't interpret that story. So some of the species that we have, we actually just don't know the full ages they were or that they could have gotten to here on PEI. The picture on the right is just a really cool looking lichen. It's a pretty uncommon swamp tree lichen on PEI. That cool golden serratia on the edges. But it grows really slowly. So some of those species like that grow less than a millimeter a year, some fraction of that. And so you can find ways to kind of think about that. If it's as big as my hand, right, that's decades old. And if it needs really specific shade levels or humidity levels, or it doesn't like salt, it tells me stories about what's been going on in that little plot of land for maybe decades. So when we look at our species and we start reading them, they tell us stories about winds over centuries. That big old tree by East Point is bent right over, and it's been doing that for, I would say, easily over 100 years, but I don't know how long because I don't want to core it. It's good how it is. We don't need to know the specifics. Now, sometimes it's the communities. So those grassy looking things, there's a bunch of species in there, but a bunch of them are our salt marsh grasses, right? They're pretty recognizable. And I don't even need to go taste that water. You can know that it's brackish, right? So you can start to look at these various kind of combinations. And often they work together. We often hear the survival of the fittest, kind of competition rules nature. But that last picture is the kind of ground of what they call the dune barrens. It's not very barren, and it's a whole group of plants that all and fungi that work together. And without each other, none of them can grow there. Trees tell us stories too. Wood is a very cool process. We do whole presentations on just how to look at the wood, but they tell us stories of past conditions or species or old farms or, woodcutters who just got defeated by the tree or even ancient forests that got buried by past hurricanes, right? So there's lots of these little hidden stories around PEI, especially along our coasts. Now, sometimes those hidden stories can really help our restoration and our stewardship. They can tell us about the neighborhood, what kind of animals we're thinking about. If I know I've got that raccoon, there's bigger prints and there's a set of smaller prints, right? There's at least one pup. So I've got a mama and a kit, wherever that was. I think that's on the Montague somewhere. But, that starts making me inform. Maybe I want to put up a nest box if I don't have great big tree cavities for them. Those windy spruce at the bottom is telling me that whatever I'm planting there, it's going to be winded. You know, it's letting me know what I'm about to put that plant through if I'm working on building a hedgerow in that area. And that multi-stem maple is just telling me stories about what humans did earlier. Trees grow like that after they've been cut down. And, maybe a beaver did it, but beavers usually would leave a big chunk of the log because they mostly just want the branches, right? So the fact that there's no log in the ground there suggests that someone took it away, and that's usually humans, right? So I can tell that there was cutting there, maybe, 40, 50 years ago. And we've kind of learned to do this through teaching kids mostly. Eric, especially, he wrote a whole book on it. So we've got lots of resources on our website that aren't specific to the coast, but are really helpful for starting to look at these patterns. And it's not always about knowing all the species names. It's not about knowing every single one, but it's being able to kind of look at things and go, look at that beak. That beak might be for shoveling water plants. This one might be for pecking at wood. So it gives you a chance just to start to take those skills and start interpreting what you're seeing, which will not only make your property, whether it's on the coast or not, a lot more fun to romp around on, but you'll start to have really great ideas for what animals are using it, where plants are stressed out, where you might find a rare species, all these kinds of fun things. And this happens at a much more bigger landscape level. Because on PEI, especially I grew up here, we tend to think of these rolling, gentle hills of pastoral productivity and our beachy, beautiful sand dunes, right? But our natural history is that we were 98% plus forested when Europeans arrived with these tall, great trees of the Wabanaki forest, and it's not that changing that is completely a bad thing or a good thing. It's just that being aware of what the natural capacity and kind of history of PEI is really makes us understand the choices in landscape use that we've made. We can produce a lot of food on those hills, but we take away that tree protection that slows winds and waves during, hurricanes, which we saw after Fiona. So yeah, PEI, I like this. This is the picture after Fiona. Um, it is, I remember growing up in the campaign where we were dubbed the Gentle Island. And at the time, it seemed fine, good slogan. But the more I've learned about our natural history and the more I've lived here on PEI and explored the coast and lived through a few climate change powered hurricanes, you start to go, maybe we're not as gentle as we dubbed ourselves. Even the word epiquet, which when I was a kid, I was told it meant cradled in the waves, which gives you a very, warm beach day feeling. It really used to be translated more as lying in the water, which could be very relaxing, but not necessarily so. And so that picture shows the sediment loss of our kind of hardened sand dune island. And it shows the algae bloom from all the nitrogen that we put into our soil that came off in that storm. But it also shows that diversity in wild landscape that is PEI. And you can see the heavily forested areas that are very swampy in the west and our kind of northeast older forests, as well as a whole bunch of other patches, and then the patchwork of agricultural land. And, being coastal is one thing, but we're also in the northern hemisphere. So we freeze thaw every year. Whatever we do in our landscape and the conditions that our properties face, they really kind of vibrate across the seasons, right? So you've got this, harsh winters, and especially if you're a cottage property owner who maybe doesn't get here in the winter times and hasn't experienced a coast in the winter, it's a very different place. So we have these native plants that have been cycling through these cycles, not just every season, but over much larger cycles of glaciers, even longer, larger, worse condition winters. And this has really shaped the land. And this is really not just fun. I know I'm going into glacier stuff, and you're like, I thought we were going to talk about the coast, Dan. And that's fair. I go sometimes off on tangents. But in this case, the glaciers really bulldozed off most of our soil, scraped our bare sandstone down back to the rockiest parts, and, filled up a few valleys with soil and eradicated most of the life and plants that were living there. Even the seeds were pushed out. And so when you're starting back from that, that's a really tough place to grow. It's a lot like a sand dune, right? Exposed to the winds and waters and salts, no tree cover to protect you, not much soil. And what little soil you have is very sandy. So understanding this kind of ecological succession after these disturbance events, a glacier is just one giant clear cut or bulldozing in a parking lot build for a little while. How our system kind of grows and recovers and all the members that are needed to rebuild those soils and provide shade and protection and how they work together, is a really important concept when you're trying to do restoration, or whether it's a hedge, shoreline planting, or even working on a whole coastal forest. And there's some cool species like that liverwort that act as like these cool little germinating spots that catch cool seeds and soak up waters and things like that. And it's really, as Eric mentioned earlier, it's really important to remember too that humans are a native part of the Wabanaki forest. We're a native species. When the Mi'kmaq first came to PEI in the Mi'kmaqui region, so the Maritimes, it was 12,000 years ago when those glaciers that were here for quite a while were melting, but they weren't gone. And the land that they revealed would have been more of a tundra. right? And then eventually kind of more of a boreal forest as things warmed a bit. And then eventually you would have had all the different species that we know and love today. And so the Mi'kmaq people were here on the land, stewarding it, living off of it, extracting things, but also planting things, before hemlock were and before even our provincial tree red oak arrived. So sometimes it's good to remember that us as a species, we're really actually part of it. We actually brought a different culture of land use eventually. And that's where the changes really started to happen with our relationship with the land. And so this is Basin Head Provincial Park. That's Gary and I trying to figure out lichens, also picking seeds and eating some berries. But it's a great provincial park. So if you've not visited it, it's up near Surrey. It is lovely. And it's a really cool example of a big secondary or grain dune system, as we call them. But the cool thing about it is it's this like living example of succession in action. So you can see the 1935 photo there's a bunch of bare sand, right? It's been blasted by something, hurricane. Um, but in 1974, nobody did anything. This is just a natural system working on its own in time. Some tourists, I'm sure, visited. But other than that, you can see it recovered quite a bit of growth on various spots. And that's pure sand. It's just, really hard to grow in sand along the coast, wind, salts, everything. Very dry. But our little lichen friend there, they can do it. They can not only survive the heat of the sand, we've all walked on bare hot sand, it's hot, that burns roots. But they can also sequester different micronutrients out of the air. They can secrete them into the soils. If we go to the next picture, you can see that reindeer lichen there. It gets a bit tall. It sponges up water, releases it when it's dry. It actually reflects sunlight, so the sand is less, is not as hot. Protects seeds, acts as a germination carpet. It does all this stuff, and eventually you get this bevy of specialist species. Still a tough place to grow. It's the sand dune, but you have this barren or heath or secondary dune system that develops. And as those develop and decompose and build soils, then eventually you'll start to have actually a dune forest develop. Often a black spruce or white spruce or balsam fir, but eventually you'll start having some other species too. Now, in a dune system, any systems like this, but a dune especially, you're going to have some destruction in the mix. So you can see that blowout kind of valley in the dune system. That's from a wind event that scooped out sand and left a low area that then probably filled with water and let more trees grow. Near the coast, you're going to have whole blast out, but those dead trees or half living trees are actually still doing a job of holding sands together and slowing winds for whatever habitat or property is just inland from that. So sometimes it's that interconnected protection. And if you let this go long enough, we used to have along the national park huge, vast systems of this that are no longer there. And in those systems, we had packs of wolves and caribou. Caribou eating those reindeer mosses, right? Caribou are reindeer by Norwegian standards. And so, we had these systems, and I couldn't find pictures of it on PEI, but I could find one of the closer systems that have this unique combination left is in Alaska on the other side of the continent. There is also something in some areas in Newfoundland that have this, but it's a pretty unique system. And we lost ours, maybe 150, 100 years ago. And if you let that develop in space and time, you get the Bedumagek National Park Reserve. So this is a new national park reserve that's being stewarded, always has been stewarded by Lennox Island and the Mi'kmaq people, but now they're stewarding it with Parks Canada, and it's going to be both protected and conserved. And I got the chance to be boated out there a few different times, always magical, never enough to explore the whole thing. But as you can see, it's this kind of like 11-kilometer long stretch of dunes. It's got some igneous rock, which is crazy. Kate McCory has a really good blog post if you want to learn more about that. And then it has some forested coastal islands that are relatively untouched. People have been there. The Mi'kmaq have been there. I don't count that too much because they touch very lightly. But there was like a little cabin foundation I found in there. So it's not that there's never been anything there, but it's relatively compared to the rest of PEI. And you can see it's just protecting the Malpeque Bay, a really productive bay for fisheries. That's not connected at all to this chain of protective sandbar islands. Um, and it's this really beautiful, amazing habitat, but pretty low growing, not huge dunes, and not a lot of tree growth. And the tree growth that there is pretty low. but it still manages to protect this coastal forest island just behind it. And if you head in there, I was expecting like a cool forest, but not these species. That's Gary, who's a little over 6 feet, standing beside a mature provincial red oak, right? That's supposed to be a species that doesn't grow that close to the coast here in PEI usually. And it was growing with sugar maple, white ash, white birch, red maple, a lot of the usual culprits, but it's one of the most diverse canopies and forest floors that I've really seen on PEI. Some really unique species, almost not found anywhere else. And it's just because it wasn't touched much. But this is a coastal forest exposed to high, high winds. And I've been there post Fiona, and it still looks pretty good. Yeah, it had a little bit of damage. It's right on the coast, but it did not completely crumple. It actually came through it. That oak is still there, still standing. It just lost a couple of little branches. Doing great. So there's a lot of untapped potential with our coastal properties. And I know that for many coastal properties, you're not going to make a 500,000-year-old forest on your land within your generation or maybe at all. But we can learn lessons from these places and learn about the resiliencies and the combination of species and how they're set up. And that can help inform, our restoration work and our protection. So yeah, so just to summarize, we had this crazy cool province. I want to remake this map because I have blank areas. I couldn't find data on that stuff, so I left them blank. But they were forested too. So you can see we are very forested, 98% forested. Trees were long lived, so 200-year-old to 1,000-year-old trees, very common. Over 3 meters in diameter was quite common, over 30 meters tall. And then we had a whole bevy of wetland and coastal habitats and dunes and many more creatures and bears than we had, bears, lynx, martens, all kinds of stuff, more than we had today, as well as humans that whole time. And of course, if we're going to do a bit of natural history, we have to go to, when colonization, when Europeans arrived here. And, it's one of those things where because I do this from an ecological perspective, I feel a little guilty. I always make it sound like, well, then Europeans came and goodbye to all that splendor you just talked about. These were my ancestors too, right? And most of the people doing the cutting were not rich landlords in Britain. These were people who were sent to PEI, forced to survive in as we just talked about, massive forest system, right? An unsettled land without much support, slow shipments. And there was often, when you look into the history, and this is where natural history or the museums, PEI is really great. There was points where PEI wasn't allowed to import various foods or supplies, and we had to go without or make them ourselves, right? So there was many reasons for the need to clear land, and the cultures we brought with it that were used to doing it this way, but it did have a vast effect, as you can see that United States map. I know it's not PEI, but it really shows you how much forest and land was cleared over the years before we were all alive. And so recognizing that change in habitat and resiliency to wind events and lack of moisture, all the changes that come with that, it's not to put a judgment on them, but it is to recognize what they're functionally doing. So yeah, so we did slash and burn. We came Europeans, often settled coastal areas first, drained salt marshes for livestock and dune meadows for all kinds of different stuff. And often to get the clearing started, could start with a burn. That even led crops to be a little bit better. You could plant amongst the burnt out stumps until you got a chance to remove them. And if you burned a little extra forest, it wasn't always seen as a bad thing. So controls were harder, but also maybe lazier sometimes. And so there was vast areas. We don't know much about this because it wasn't historically mapped out, and it's hard to find the charcoal. And it's a little intricate science studies to figure out more about this. But there are some historic fires, in particular in the 1750s. There was two fires that got escaped from St. Peter's and burned all the way to East Point. And that's a big, big area, right? And those are some beautiful forests nowadays. So we can see that recovery too, where it's not that long ago that they experienced really bad wildfires they're not used to. And we did this again, as I said, there was a purpose. We exchanged our ecology for economy, right? And we needed to. We needed to survive. And so you can look at those the graphs there from Doug Sobey, and those are just, that's the harvesting numbers. I don't have to worry about the exact amounts, but you can see over the 1800s, we really, in about 5 decades, cleared most of PEI, right? And we did that to build ships, to get farming, to make our industry, and to have cool mustaches and stand around for photos on logs. It's so as settlers made farmland, as we divvied up properties, as we cleared coasts, we changed the conditions of PEI. We set up farming. And, people still remarked on the wild landscape. People loved nature on PEI. There's lots of poems from the 1800s and books, Anne of Green Gables among them, that talk about our wildscapes and how much they love them and our wild species. So it's a funny mixture of destruction and adoration. And there was decisions made not even by us. Some British map makers were like, let's divvy up properties. And this is a really beautiful map. I love the map. I use it for my map teaching courses and stuff. But when you think about this from an ecological stewardship, every river and coastline is now just broken up into 100 different stewards that all have different goals, different knowledge bases, and no plan united to look at those processes or protect those places. And this effect is continued. This is a kind of little 3D map I made of just the Orwell area, but you can still see those old property lines and those embossed hedgerows and forest edges, right? So these kind of political decisions from another continent, and imaginary map drawings then suddenly have ecological and functional consequence for centuries. So yeah, so I just want to paint that story that, we have to take into account the change in habitat and the land clearing that went on during the colonial period, and that's a huge part of PEI's culture. Look at those barns on the cliffs, but it's complicated, and so it's not a villainous thing. And I think that that's one of the things we can do now is we can relook at that relationship and we can make some different decisions going forward and balance that out a little bit more. Now, as I said, people during that era, as much as they were cutting them down, they loved romping around, they loved exploring, and they loved writing about this stuff. So lots of great island journals. Again, the PI museums has great resources on all this stuff. So there's just some different quotes there I put down just of people talking about these coastal forests. And the one that kind of inspires me the most, Selkirk's pretty smart on it, but the last one there, Johnston, talks about after passing through that thicket, almost impenetrable to the foot of man, after passing through it, you find larger trees growing more apart, right? And he's talking about that coastal forest that we now don't see very often, but that still exists in places like Budumagek. Now, good news over the last century, as things shifted, as industries changed, as demographics changed, all kinds of stuff. We had areas that we put under conservation, like the Dalvey area. And you can see that shift between, over those almost 100 years from farms into dune, farm fields literally into dunes, to back to forested land, but a huge reduction on the dune landscape, right? And it's now forested land with a road running through it. It is still very different, but it's much more treed. And we still have shores that have grown back up. So that bottom picture there with that cliffside forest and that both bottom pictures actually, those were both farm fields in the 1950s. But both of them were abandoned, and that's what's happened naturally. Nobody went and planted that forest. That's local seed sources moving in and just recovery over, 75-ish years. Still got a lot more recovering to do. Now, that being said, some areas were cleared for farming, grew back in a forest, and now have been cleared again for tourism and cottages and things like that, which great cottage spots, but that place got hit pretty hard in Fiona. There's not a lot of protection. So, the summary is just, we've really changed. The big thing I learned post Fiona was a big storm, but there's been a lot of storms like that. Or at least enough. It's a pattern that has repeated. The biggest change was our ecology. We went from this diverse Wabanaki forest with large, long-lived old trees, deep roots, tall canopies, to a much, much different forest with a lot of different species and a lot of species that used to be here that aren't any longer. We simplified that system. We lowered its resilience. And that does reduce the resilience of the whole province and all of our properties. When we don't have roots in the ground keeping erosion levels down, that changes our dune building processes. When our forests are all evergreen or often called borealized now, all white spruce or all balsam fir, and very few areas of hardwoods. If we keep them younger than 60 years, all of these choices of stewardship have effects on what kind of water filtration we'll get, how much wind protection we'll get, how much erosions will slow. And especially along our coasts. If you're going to be doing any afforestation, if you've got a mowed coast or an old field that you're trying to restore, right, this is a really harsh place because you're not only on the coast being blown by all those things, but there's nothing else there to really protect you. The soils could be depleted of organic matter. And that's where this process of ecological succession, thinking about what species and what order I'm going to be putting them in, and sometimes just not mowing and giving it a few years to let some of the natural, things, some of them will be non-native weeds, but they are vegetation holding soils in place and changing those conditions and holding more moisture so that you're able to start planting what you really want, right? So sometimes it's a bit of a time process. So the coastal processes, our whole island could really be thought of as that kind of top left-hand picture of that's a little coastal forest on Tracadie Island, a little sandbar off Tracadie Bay. And that's really a kind of a little metaphor for our whole island. You got that northern towards the left, where everything's deformed the most. Towards the center, where we've actually got some cover and distance from the shore, we're getting less deformed winds and taller trees. And then towards kind of the southern shore, our Northumberland Strait, where the winds are generally lower, you have some coastal deformation and erosion, but not quite as much. And so wind is this dynamic shaping force that powers our waves, throws salt crystals, pulls sand. So it's not the only force to worry about along the coast, but it is a very powerful driving force. And that complicated interconnected chart is just trying to illustrate how interconnected some of these forces are. If I'm thinking about winds, I'm not just worried about a hurricane coming. Those winds every day are sucking moisture from my leaves of my, non-evergreen plants. And so it's going to be a drier growing site. So I might want more organic matter to hold moisture or better mulching, or I might want to water more often when I plant in those spots, at least initially, right? So just being able to recognize some of those signs and some of the consequences of those forces is really important. Yeah, so one of the ways to judge your local wind, because measuring wind is very nuanced and hard and long, is just starting to think about your coastal exposure. Are you right on the coast, especially if you're like at the headland, or are you on a coast but you're more in an estuary? That's going to start to give you signals. And some of them can be very broad. You can, break up your property into, maybe you have a big property and you've got a bit of everything. Totally fine to divvy it up and say, oh, I've got some full coastal exposure and some sheltered exposure. But ultimately, if you're on the coastal exposure side, you're going to get all of it. Winds, waves, the whole mix, probably. If you're on the sheltered estuary side, well, you'll probably be more prone to coastal flooding, but maybe a little bit less to some low level winds or regular winds. But a windstorm you might be very vulnerable to. So looking at that. Now, you might even not be on the coast. If you're in this seminar and you're not on the coast, thank you for coming, even though it's about the coast. But maybe, you live along the Hillsborough River or one of the, the Murray River at one of its wider areas or near the Brudenell Park, right? Those are kind of semi-coastal. Yeah, high winds, waters, you still have salt in that water a little bit. And you've got these wind corridors that winds can get pretty high. And I have seen crumbs, holts, and kind of misshapen trees even inland in those sites. And maybe you have a property, inland at the top of a hill, So there's different versions of exposure, but all of them come with kind of some patterns of consequence, which, we'll get into in one of the other, we'll get deeper into in one of the next slideshows or next webinars. That's what they're called. So, there's a wind map based on wind data from the Canada Wind Atlas, just to give you, it's very broad data, so not great for your own specific property, but it gives you an idea of the regions where we're experiencing kind of the highest average winds. So this is the annual mean wind speed, so it's kind of meant to represent the average. So obviously storms are way higher, there can be calmer days, but just giving you that average. And it's not the number that matters, but you can see it really is our North Shore that's exposed to the biggest winds. So if your property is located along those parts, you're going to be wanting to think about these high wind, potentially even crumholzing habitats and learning some lessons for those. If you're in the more sheltered bays or along the Northumberland coast, you can actually take a lot of standard planting or restoration advice from other McPhail's material or any of the other groups doing stuff because some of those coastal forces are going to be moderated. They're just not going to, they're there. You want to keep them in mind, but they're not necessarily going to change all of your strategies. So, first, just getting a breadth assessment on sure, I live on the coast, but maybe I don't have to worry as much about these constant heavy pressures. And maybe I'm just going to worry about the bigger storm events and try to build up resilience for that. It starts to give you help on planning. And erosion obviously is a huge part of why we're probably all here, wondering when is Dan going to tell me how to stop erosion? And it's going to happen. We are a sandbar that is eroding naturally. The thing that's changed is we've sped up the erosional rates and we've changed how erosion and sediment moves around PEI through a whole bunch of ways. Denuding the landscape and farming right up the coast definitely does that, but so does dredging. So does the different ways that we use our beaches through tourism, and all those different things. Rock armoring obviously is another one. So, some of those historic pictures of the bottom show you Cabot Beach. It's another provincial park. We're actually going to be doing some work there. And it used to have this whole royalty sand beach in the 1840s. And by 1935, 100 years later, it's gone, right? I have a little yellow blob showing you where it was. And now those dunes are revealing the cliffs below. I can find dune plants growing on the tops of those cliffs where they're not really supposed to grow, but they're just holdovers left over from dunes that are no longer getting the sand they need. And that picture above showing you some of those red arrows are showing you where sand moves, and then the dredging things I added show you where the dredging happens, right? So we're dredging on either side of that park for just like because we need to. I get why we do it. I'm not saying dredging's bad. I'm just simply saying that stops the sand from being delivered to that provincial park. So it's a dune system that is slowly losing its dunes, right? Because it's not getting fed anymore. So our coasts are really interconnected, and that's through these littoral cells. So that map with all those different, take Nish, Melpeck, Cavendish, those are all our littoral cells. And you can think of them kind of like a watershed group for the coast. These are interconnected coastal areas where transportation of sediment and erosion and deposition and dune building and all that kind of stuff is all connected and works together. So that's one of those things where people can be doing things along your coast that can be having effects. So being aware sometimes of where dredging happens nearby, whether there's harbors nearby, whether something has changed along your coast might explain some issues you're having that sadly, you might not be able to directly address yourself. Or if you're trying to directly address them and it keeps not working, it might explain your failure. That's not your fault, and it could be a nice moment where you're like, oh, wait, this isn't me. I've been trying my best and I still can't fix it. And so when you put all that together, winds, waves, exposure, plus the type of soil, plus the wind speeds on average, you start to develop our diverse coastline, right? With our bays, our headlands, and with all our different coastal types. And these coastal types are really, kind of a combination between what kind of soil you've got and that exposure to coastal forces and a bit of a, geomorphic history and geology. But to sum it up, really, there's kind of three different kinds. That's the easiest way to put it. You could get more nuance for sure. But we've basically got, most of PEI would be considered cliff or bluff, which you might call, they can be varying in height. We've got our famous big tall ones, but there's lots that are like a meter high. They're not very tall. Our low plains would be our salt marshes, some of the wetlands, and kind of where we just, fields roll right into the ocean, basically. And then there's our dune systems, right? And so you can see kind of that placement using that map. Not the best resolution because there's more marshland. It's just hidden under the red colors, I think. Um, but these each play different roles too, and what communities of plants you see, how risky erosion might be, whether you've got to worry about dry soils, wet soils, salt flooding, these kinds of things. So again, in the following presentations, as well as the materials we've been putting out, we're going to use all these kind of hopefully simplified categories to help you go, I'm on a cliff, I got to worry about erosion and wind, and just have at least some key points for you to take away from that. Oh, I explained everything, forgetting there was this slide too. So there was another slide about it. I'm just going to move on. So yeah, so you can get more nuanced, as I said, and you can think about these things conceptually and be like, oh, I see how drainage is made, things like that. And there's a lot of use in all these different things. But again, it's just trying to look at things and go, what are the stories? So the one we're going to be trying to help address some of this with this project, but that lower left-hand picture doesn't look like much. It looks like a few spruce trees and a bit of grassy stuff. But there's a bunch of dead stuff behind the road at the back. And those are dead cedar trees back there. That's Cedar Dunes Park. Wait, no, that might be Jacques Cartier Park. They both had this problem. I think it's Cedar Dunes. it's Cedar. Let's say it's Cedar Dunes. This happened there, so maybe I put in the wrong picture. But those are dead cedar trees at the back, and we were trying to figure out why they died because they're pretty far from the shore, and you can see those trees closer to the shore in front of that road are green. They didn't die. And what we realized was the salt flooding went over the road, but couldn't get back out of the road. And so it just sat in this unique cedar dune forest that the provincial park is named after. And it literally killed a whole bunch of trees. Now, they grow on dune soil, these cedars. And so normally they probably gotten flooded many, many times over the last however many thousand years. But normally that trickles and drains out of that high drainage soil, but we've changed the drainage patterns, right? And we've created an issue where we're now losing a very unique island habitat that you should go visit because parts of it are being hit by crazy storms, which we're going to be fixing, of course. And so all of this being said, once in a while we do have crazy storms, but it's more a while than once. Like we do it a lot, after Fiona, because I was starting to study coastal stuff before Fiona. Then Fiona hit, and we all went through our panic and depression and all the different feelings. And I thought, oh, my coastal sites are going to be destroyed. And then I was blown away that most of my coastal sites looked really good. Now we were trying to find healthy coastal sites to study first. So we were looking at healthier forests, and they actually fared the storm really well. But that map's all based on data from NOAA, I think, which is like a North American wide storm watch thing. I downloaded and made the map. But you can see how many storms have passed over or near PEI in the region. It's a lot. Most of them don't get written about. I went through some old Guardians and stuff. Well, many of them, it's a rainy day. It's nothing much, but we're on a storm trajectory. It's part of our system. And so we know we're going to be getting storms. Even before, kind of the recent climate change has been a thing, storms are part of the process. But now we've got climate change empowering them, making them more common, more powerful, right? And so this is something we just need to plan for. We have to adapt and rebuild some of that resiliency into our ecosystems, especially on the coast, to be able to survive these and then protect our inland habitats. So remember we looked at that basin head picture and I said it got hit by a hurricane. This was that hurricane, and this is one we forgot about. So there's a few famous ones we talk a lot about, but after Hurricane Fiona, I didn't know about the storm, but Alan McCachran, I want to say, from Western University, wrote an article about it. I managed to somehow find it. And, it was a really giant storm. I went back and read the old Guardians. It's kind of crazy. And some of the old Guardians read like the modern day Fiona day after Guardians, where they're like lineups around the block, but it will be for like kerosene rather than, generators. But they did some really crazy things. It washed a lot of bridges away. PEI was different then. We didn't have much tree cover, so flooding was the big problem often during this storm, not so much all the tree fall. But 5 kilometers of Greenwich Dunes moved more than 500 meters inland. And this time, with a more powerful storm, Fiona was more powerful than this one. Those same dunes lost 20 meters off the front dune and didn't really move because Parks Canada took over and let the natural system rebuild its resiliency to these kinds of events. A lesson to be learned. So yeah, so once I get out after Fiona, you can see I could go on about this, and I've already gone on too long. I know I'm over time, but those are some of the sites pre and post Fiona. Very little change, right? Where we had developed crumholts and coastal forest or coastal habitat, less erosion, faster recovery, right? Held better soils. And then there was a whole bunch of other benefits I've realized since then, where these are part of how our system changes. These big storm and windfalls and things are part of it. And it's that we've made a forest that didn't like getting blown down, whereas our old forests used to be able to take it and one or two trees would fall down, right? So it has been a wake-up call and a way to think about how our forests change and how they're trying to heal. And then it connected to my black ash project, which blew my mind. And started finding some black ash along the coast in Lennox Island and a few other spots on PEI. I went to look at alpine and coastal crumholts in Cape Breton. I was wandering by an alpine lake, and lo and behold, there's black ash growing there. And that's a seed that apparently only moves by wind. So how do you get to the top of a Cape Breton mountain? Hurricane, probably, right? So everything started connecting. And then I started reading some papers saying that, well, healthy habitats along our coasts actually feed our shell fisheries and make those more productive and healthier and more resilient to disease. So you're just kind of going, wow, we're just skimming the surface of the importance of these habitats. And this was all through that Krumholtz project and coastal forest stuff. That's Eric filming for the coastal forest video, which you can watch on YouTube if you haven't already. So I came to think of all of our ecology, but these things is this aging green infrastructure, right? But not one and done infrastructure, an infrastructure that starts to grow and take care of itself, that tells us stories, and that's part of these landscapes that we love, right? So that's that big old balsam fir near the lighthouse again at East Point, right? Just you can see where it's holding the line of soil. We're after Fiona and after Dorian and after Juan and after all Edna and all the ones before that. And it's been doing that whole time, keeping that cliff edge. You can see its roots getting exposed, but it's still holding on and it's still living. So that was, thank you very much for listening. I managed to get through the whole thing without like going crazy over, but it's impressive if you've heard me talk before, that's impressive for me. Next time, in 2 weeks' time, we're going to be talking about coastal communities and natural neighbors. So we'll be talking a bit more about the habitats, animals, plants, and their functions along these cool coasts. So get registered for that if you want to. Also, don't forget we'll have plantings coming up. You can find all of this information on our socials or on our website. So by all means, get registered, get looking at it, find somewhere near you, bring your kids. It's going to be a great time. Yeah, and I'm going to stop screen sharing and then we'll address questions and such.
So I'm going to start with one question, Dan.
Yes.
What would you suggest should be the first thing that people do when thinking about the kind of natural history, their properties, and all the stuff you talked about? Like, what would you like tonight if you're going to go look at bit of
One
coast?
thing you can do, I mean, yeah, go for a little walk and just start thinking about your coastline. If now is a really good time where the ground's still kind of frozen, so you can tell where your wet areas are, where things are pooling, right? You can see erosional stuff. This is a good time too, as the snow's melting. If you are living constantly in a property, you know it well, you can get out there and you can see, what happened this winter, right? Because that's going to tell you stories about what's gone on under all that ice and snow and marine forces you didn't know were happening, and start planning out for your spring planting. So I think there's those kinds of things. As far as actions you can do too, is if you have an area that you don't need to mow along the coast, stop mowing it. Like by all means, mow a yard, mow around your playground, make a sweet bike jump pattern, make a corn maze, like whatever you like. Not no judgment. But if there's an area you're mowing and you can go, wait, why do I mow this? Right? That's a clear cut every time you mow, stopping anything from developing there that's going to build resilience. So anywhere you can say, I'm going to let this go just fallow and adjust my aesthetic expectations about this rather than try to keep this trim. That's going to make it when you want to go plant there, or when you go to plant there, you'll find things already growing there, like bayberry or wild rose or other things, right? So sometimes just a bit of inaction is actually a really good first action.
I've got a question from Ed Harrison. What do you recommend for that depth of no mow zone?
I'm assuming you mean from the coast inwards,
Yeah.
as much as you can. Like I'm a bit of a tree hugger, if you couldn't tell. So by my standard, I want 500-meter buffer zones, like something crazy. But no, no, I would say, yeah, 15 meters is a good starting place, especially along high wind erosional areas, or areas prone to coastal flooding. That's going to get you started. Um, it really, again, that's why, when we came up with this project, and then it's like, okay, write a booklet and do some webinars to tell all the disparate landowners across PEI how to steward coastal properties. It's a diverse place. That's what that slideshow was trying to, start to say. So yeah, that's where I was trying to say, judge your exposure, try to judge what your winds are at. And the cool thing you can do about that is we'll have these resources in the booklet on the website. I don't have them for you today, I'm sorry, but we'll get these to you. There's a number of government you can go through if you Google PEI historic aerial photos, they have a whole thing where you can go look at your properties in 1935, 1958, 1974. You can see coastline changes. You can see where land coverage. Maybe you can see old farmhouses or wells you didn't know were once on your property. You can see some cool stuff. They also have coastal hazard information platform chip, I want to call it. And so you can look at what's my likelihood of flooding or sea level rise. That can be really useful, especially if you're on a, salt marsh or low plain or somewhere in a bay. Um, so we have a few of those, and then you can actually go to the Canada Wind Atlas, and they have like a visualizer. The data resolution's huge, so it's going to be like 16 kilometers around your property. So it's not like your property, but it'll give you ideas on what are my average winds. You can look at it different seasons. The thing I don't like about recommending all of that stuff is that you can get lost in the numbers. At the end of the day, most days when you walk out to have a coffee in the deck, are you blasted by a wind? If you put a plant in the ground, do the roots rock, right? Just looking at those little clues that are saying, do birds hang out in the open in your yard on the coast, or do they always hide? Because that means it's always windy. They don't like it, right? So it's just thinking about those clues and those tells. Yeah, but 15 meters to keep my answer to an answer. Let's say 15 to 30 meters, I would say, as far as like an ecological balance is great. But if you can afford more, 75, I really think our riparian buffers should be at least 75 meters rather than the 15 we have, but I'll accept 15. It's a lot better than zero.
And
Um,
I think too, like the good way to think of it is not mowing doesn't mean you can't mow cool paths into it. Or
totally. Yeah.
or think about like how you're going to change and frame your view differently and how you want to create different places that are more, comfortable and less windy. And so it is a long term, it's not just a matter of like distance, it's also time. So I think like not mowing is a great way to start, but it really should be that first step when you're actually thinking about, after you maybe let the mowing happen for a few years and you've got a good complement of grasses, sedges, other plants in kind of working together, then you can interplant with shrubs that again aren't going to block your view, but are going to start adding deeper roots into the soil. And eventually you're going to want to think about adding trees that are going to add those much deeper, stronger roots that are going to actually kind of cement your land in place, or at least help to do that. So I think you really do want to, yeah, think about time, think about your, think about where you are relative to your shore and how immediate your needs are. Um, I think that is it for questions, and that's pretty much it for time. I'd like to thank all of you for coming and attending tonight. That was really fantastic, Dan. That was an awesome presentation.
Awesome. Thank you. It's very thank you and thank you for being patient. As we said, we don't do webinars a lot, and I can't when I'm presenting, I just see my screen. There's a point where you're like halfway through and you're like, is anyone hearing me? Am I alone? Am I just now talking to myself it's a very weird compared to being out on a property with someone. So I really recommend if you can get involved in one of the plantings. We want your free labor, so this is a mixed ask, but really come out because that's where this shines, right? This is like it's so much easier to learn this stuff when you're touching the plants, when you're getting the smells of balsam fir, when you're feeling sand hit your eyeballs, and you're like, oh, plants sit here 24/7 winter all the time with sand hitting their, you know, stomatic eyeballs. So it's one of those things. But anyway, thank you so much. I'll stop talking. It was so nice to do this, and I'll hopefully see you all in 2 weeks.